Kins, a regular occasion for me, although obviously we're not physically in Kins, but Kins has been a home away from home for us from Skokie for the past decade and beyond since we've lived in Skokie. But you didn't mention, Dr. Karish, that probably my claim to fame, my greatest claim to fame here is that I have very close friends who live in West Rogers Park, and one of my best friends in the world is Yakira Amster, who happens to be your granddaughter. So I'm just saying, I have other claims to fame other than academics, because Yakira and I, we go way back.
Well, thank you. She's one of our favorite granddaughters also.
Don't take sides. I don't want to hear any favorites on this call afterwards when it's not, official. So our topic today is risk assessment, which in the context of a discussion about science and mathematics is obviously very important, because science is the mechanism through which we have data. Science provides us with data, and mathematics gives us the information that we need to make the kind of decisions that we make. The question is, how do we, from a Torah perspective, how do we relate to this data? And this is obviously something which I'm sure some of you are thinking about during this time when we're struggling with the coronavirus pandemic, that there's a lot of data which is out there, and there are a lot of questions of risk. And the question is, how does the halacha process the information, the data, and the real life scenarios? So for example, we're dealing with, in the coming week, please God, the celebration of Rosh Hashanah Haba L'Neila L'Tova. Well, how long should the davening be? Well, how about blowing the shofar, with a mask, without a mask, in the shul, out of the shul? These are all questions that involve risk assessment, because as many of you are familiar, I had conversations from the Kolel standpoint with physicians, specifically people involved in infectious disease. Well, they will tell you, well, there's nothing that is risk-free in the world. Nothing has no risk. Even staying at home has a risk. Going outside has a risk. Driving a vehicle, a car has a risk. Taking a bus, taking a plane, everything has a risk. Coronavirus adds new risks, new complications. How much time? Well, that's a risk factor. Indoors versus outdoors, another risk factor. These are all being driven by data, by scientific information that's being accrued as we speak. Trying to sift through it is a question. The question is, how do we relate to this data? So the halacha relies on scientific data, but it looks at it with a specific lens of values. And that's what we need to think about, is the interplay between the data and the values. So a way to think about this, a way to start this conversation, is a story. The story is the story of the 4 lepers. Any of you familiar with the story of the Arba Mitzoraim? I don't know if we can see any hands there. You can put up a little hand. The 4 lepers, the Arba Mitzoraim. So the tradition, although it's not clear from the Psukim, that these 4 lepers were Gehazi of the fame of Elisha. He was Elisha's helper, and Gehazi and his 3 children. The pasuk tells us in Sefer Malachim Beis, in Perek Vav and Perek Zayin, that these 4 lepers they're anonymous, but let's assume they were Gehazi and his kids. They were standing outside of the shar of the gate in the Shomron, and there was a terrible famine. There was a siege from the Arameans, from Machane Aram. And they made the following calculation. They said to each other, look, if we sit here at the gate, we will certainly die of starvation. But if we surrender to the Arameans, to Machane Aram, what will happen? We don't know. There's the possibility that they may kill us, and there is also the possibility that they may take us as POWs. So here you have a classic case of risk assessment, where these 4 lepers have to decide, do they stay here and definitely die in the next 3 days? Or do they take the chance, do they take the risk of maybe somebody will give them food and let them live what we call in halacha chaye olam, in perpetuity. Obviously, no one lives in chaye olam, nobody lives in perpetuity, but they will live beyond the momentary life that they would die in very short time from starvation, or not. So this is a question of risk. They have to assess the risk. And what do they do? Does anybody remember what actually happens to them? Anybody, I don't know if anybody's unmuted for this, but what actually happens is, anybody remember Malachim Beis? Do they leave their spot and go, or do they stay and die of starvation? What happens? You can put it in the chat. Nobody typing yet. Mrs. Karish moved out of the screen because she's worried I'm going to call on her. Right, for those who remember, they surrendered to the Arameans. Hashem Yisbarach does a miracle. The Machane Aram, those troops all evacuate, and there's tons of food. So that story, the Gemara quotes that story. It's quoted, by the way, for those who remember, as the Haftorah for Parshas Mitzorah. So I remember years ago when I was studying in YU, Rav Shechter Shalita, when he gave the Parsha shir for Parshas Mitzorah, I think at least 1 year, he brought up this issue of halacha and risk assessment. So this is a good example of where the halacha says, you see from this story that it is permitted to assess the risk and take a risk upon yourself of being killed immediately if it's going to have some benefit. So what we're doing here is we're taking a risk assessment. Let's say it's 50-50. Maybe the people will be killed, maybe they won't. But we're putting the value judgment of Chaye Olam, the potential for expanded and long-term life, as part of that equation. So the halacha decides based on that equation, based on that risk assessment, that it's worthwhile. Another example of this kind of discussion is here in the Tiferes Yisrael. The Tiferes Yisrael is Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz in the 19th century. In the commentary on the Mishnah is called Yachin and Boaz. So in the end of Maseches Yuma discusses at the end the issues of perpetuating life and making sure that we expend all of our resources and energies to save people's lives, even at the cost of violating Yom Kippur and Shabbos and so on. So the Boaz here in Os Gimel, in discussing the idea of extending life, makes the following comment. Umizen nirali, it seems to me, heter, lasos, and I'm going to write this word in the chat, and I want you to read it, and maybe could somebody unmute and tell me what exactly this word says. Aleph, Yud, Nun, Aleph, Kuf, Vav, Lamed. Aleph, Tes, Yud, Aleph, Nun. What does that word say? Can somebody unmute themselves and tell me what does that word spell in the Yachin and Boaz? Somebody want to venture a guess? Unmute yourself. I think you can. You can unmute yourselves. What does that word say? It says inoculation, inoculation. This is one of the first rabbinic references to a vaccine. He says it's mutter lasos inoculation shel pakin. What is pakin? Smallpox. You're allowed to take a smallpox vaccine, even though 1 out of 1,000, where does he get this from? From the medical data. 1 out of 1,000 dies through inoculation. Nonetheless, I'll call upon him because if the person will get smallpox, it's a much worse prognosis if the person develops smallpox without the vaccine. Therefore, it's permitted to endanger yourself to take the smallpox vaccine, even though it comes with a risk, because there is a benefit of mitigating against the future of getting smallpox. So here, the Tiferes Yisrael is taking the scientific data that they knew at that time in the 19th century, that let's say 1 out of 1,000 people would die from the smallpox vaccine. But he was then saying that information, if we put it into a halakhic context, is still not going to, adrabah, it's going to require us to take, especially today, and this is going to become more interesting as the vaccine, hopefully, please God, will be developed soon, to take the vaccine in that context of the smallpox. A third example where we find this issue of mitigating risk is also just in general when it comes to risky types of behavior, when we think about it from an objective versus a subjective perspective, right? Science is usually interested in looking at life from an objective standard. Science has measurements and tools, and that's what the scientific method provides, is a standard, an objective standard. Great. What about the halacha? Is everything looked at from just an objective standard, or is there also something subjective which can be introduced? So we mentioned this Gemara, the discussion, the end of Maseches Yuma, where the Gemara there discusses the context of somebody who is ill and they need to, God forbid, they need to eat on Yom Kippur to make sure that they stay alive. So the Gemara expands this idea of eating on Yom Kippur even to the violation of Shabbos. And the Gemara quotes a series of drashos, of potential sources for this halacha, of how to know that you violate Shabbos. If God forbid somebody, if you yourself or somebody in your home, Rahman al-Islam, becomes seriously ill on Shabbos, you got to rush to the doctor, even if it means driving and violating every potential malacha on Shabbos. How do you know that? The Gemara has several sources, and the concluding one is, V'chai bahem, v'lo sheyamus bahem. A person should live and not die. And that V'chai bahem is going to trump almost all other commandments. Then the Gemara goes on, that's true, to tell us that mitzvah V'chai bahem is not only in a case of Vadai Pikuach Nefesh, a certain case where a person would die, but even if it's a Safek Pikuach Nefesh, even if it is a potential health hazard, even if it's not guaranteed that the person will die, they should take care of that medical emergency, even if it comes at the cost of violating Shabbos. Well, at what level do we start to worry? Where does the halacha draw this line? What's called something that we have to be careful about for pikuach nefesh? You know, how does that work? And then the opposite is true as well. What about something which is dangerous? If we're worried about pikuach nefesh, if we have to break Shabbos to make sure to save everybody's life, so certainly we're not allowed to take on risky behaviors. Rav Shechter Shlita points out that a person who engages in a risky behavior, which has the likelihood of diminishing their life, he talks about in terms of smoking. He says that smoking, over time, the aggregate shortens the person's life. So Rav Shechter pointed out that that's basically cumulative suicide. That's an Isser Ritzicha, because over time, science has shown that it shortens the person's life. Well, what about other risky behaviors? Everything has some risk in it. Going outside has a risk. So we can look to another area of halacha where the data is important, and this comes up in the Ramban in the beginning of Maseches Chulin, where it discusses areas of kosher. And what about particular kinds of animals that might develop simone treifa, expressions of illness that would potentially disqualify that animal? So the Ramban discusses the requirement of checking for the sirchas, the lesions on the lung of an animal, and the term which is used in halacha in this context is what we call miyot hamatzui. Miyot is a minority, hamatzui, which is found. Miyot hamatzui, a minority which is found. What is a minority which is found? So Shechter loves to quote from the Chuvas Mishkanos Yaakov from Karlin. The Mishkanos Yaakov says 10%. If there's a 10% chance that your salad is going to have bugs in it, you're mechuyev, you're obligated to check it. If there is a 10% chance that this behavior is dangerous, so you have to refrain from it, and et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to assessment of risk, on one hand, we have an objective measure of 10% or a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on what your opinion is, but let's go with 10%. So we can actually quantify it from a scientific standpoint. And then we can do a test. Let's test X number of suits from a specific brand, from a specific company, from a specific manufacturer, and we'll test those. What's the risk of them having shotness? And then we can determine whether you need to check for shotness on this suit. So that's an objective way of using risk assessment, of using data. We're going to use scientific methods. But on the other hand, there's something subjective. The Gemara has an expression, and that is called Shomer Psoim Hashem. The pasuk says God watches over the foolhardy. The Ribono Shel Olam keeps an eye out for us even when we do things that are unwise. Shomer Psoim Hashem, God watches the foolhardy. And that means that even things which have some level of danger, less than miyat hamatzui, we are allowed to take them on, because what Gemara has an expression, Dashu Bei Rabim. People don't take them seriously. People do them all the time. Yes, there is a risk of flying on an airplane, and there is a risk of taking an Amtrak train, and there's a risk of driving in a car. But that risk is less than Miyat HaMatzoi, and people, lo Dashu Bei Rabim, people don't pay attention to it. And therefore, the halacha says that risk, because of the subjective nature of how people treat it, is an acceptable level of risk. One more wrinkle in this discussion, and with this we'll conclude and open it for questions, is the following comment of the Chazon Ish. This Chazon Ish is found in the Pe'er Hadar in his biography, where the Chazon Ish was asked about pikuach nefesh, about life-saving situations, and how much risk is tolerable and how much is not, and how careful we have to be. So he says, even though we don't follow the majority, we don't follow rove when it comes to pikuach nefesh, we have to be extra careful. With things that are very far off, maybe pikuach nefesh, ein donen ke pikuach nefesh v'toloi kefi midas habitachon. It's not a function of objective data. It's subjectively defined by the person. How much bitachon do you have? How nervous are you? And that's what he explains here in the footnote. He tells this story of Rav Yosef Avram Wolf, who went to the Chazon Ish, and the Chazon Ish explained this to him about how it's subjectively defined that every person has a different personal risk tolerance. They have a different sense of how nervous they are about different activities. So as long as you're lower than the threshold of pikuach nefesh, of the miyat hamatzui, it's rachok ma'od, it's a very small chance, then it depends on your midah bitachon, and that's what Rav Shechter explains, depends on how nervous you are. If you're a person who is very nervous, you're nervous even about that 0.005% chance risk, then for you, if you're not nervous, then it's not going to be a problem. Because there's a subjective element to risk assessment in halacha, as opposed to somebody else who's more cavalier. Now, you can't be cavalier to go bungee jumping with no cord. That's suicide. That's something that's absolutely also because of guaranteed pikuach nefesh. But the halacha says that there is a subjective element when it comes to risk assessment, and that means that even though for somebody else it's going to be a problem, for you it's not going to be a problem. So to summarize, we started with the source of the 4 lepers, the story of these men who assessed the risk of being killed immediately or being taken captive alive by the POW. We mentioned the fact that the Tiferes Yisrael says you need to assess risk when it comes to thinking about how you go about medical decisions, about inoculation from smallpox. And that in that case, not only in the case of the Mitzaroim are you allowed to do the risk that was maybe you would be killed 50% because you would definitely die of starvation. The case of the vaccine is different because there, it's only 1 in 1,000 chance that you're going to die, but the benefit is a little bit different because you don't currently have smallpox. And then we talked about the concept of risk assessment in terms of saving lives versus risky behavior, and that this idea of miyat hamatzu, which comes from the Mishkanos Yaakov, which is based on a Talmudic calculation, and others disagree with that, but that concept of an objective standard of science telling us this is defined as risky, it's not one size fits all. There is a subjective element to risk assessment in halacha, both from a societal standpoint of Shomer B'Sayim Hashem. If it's something that nobody thinks is a problem, it's not risky at all for the community, so then we should consider it risky. That's why Rav Moshe Feinstein in the early years, in the 1960s, he said that smoking was permitted in those days because they said Shomer B'Sayim Hashem. They assumed that the risk was very small, and therefore people took on that level of risk. But today, now that we know that the risk is much greater, then we could not take on that risk. The last point that we made was the point from the Chazon Ish that in a personal circumstance where somebody on an individual level is assessing the risk and feeling certain, they're feeling certain confidence or they're feeling a certain sense of unease, that also plays into risk. So even though, yes, the halacha uses the scientific data when thinking about risk assessment, what's interesting is that in many cases, the person's own experience, their subjective attitude and feeling about it affects and impacts how they make a halachic decision. In addition to the objective factors of risk, there's also the subjective as well. So let's, Doc, should we give people an opportunity if anybody has any questions, thoughts, feelings? One second, I think you're muted still. Oh, now you're unmuted, great.
Okay, good. So I wanted to give you a very special thank you for your excellent presentation today. And thank you to all the participants who tuned into our Zoom meeting. Hope you all enjoyed it. And now is the appropriate time to ask our speaker a question. You may unmute yourself and ask that question. So please go ahead. Anyone?
Somebody wrote in the chat, so if you ask a Rav, he might give a different answer to me who is risk averse than to my neighbor who's not risk averse. Absolutely. That's exactly correct. Because if the level of risk that one person is willing to tolerate, as long as it's less than miatamatsu, it's not an actual danger, is something that's exactly true. We did not discuss today the question of, how much risk do we put ourselves in to save other people, to save ourselves? That's a further question, but this is just the basics. So yes, there is a subjective element. The two people might come to the rabbi with the same exact scenario of risk about going to shul on Rosh Hashanah during coronavirus, or taking a flight, or meeting someone up for coffee, and they might be in the same medical risk category, but the answer might be different.
Rabbi Brand, I have a question for you regarding smoking. It always seems to me that since we now know that it is such a risky thing to do, that it should be classified as a form of suicide. I mean, it's a slow suicide, but still, many of us who smoke, I've never done it, but many of us who smoke could give it up and either prolong or save their lives. So what is the Jewish thought about, is that suicide?
It is totally prohibited. There's no discussion. The Vada Halacha of the RCA years ago published a paper, it was, 30 pages, reiterating the same point that you just made over and over and over, that there's absolutely no justification today to allow somebody to smoke a cigarette. Now, of course, there are unique circumstances, maybe somebody for pikuach nefesh, medical reasons, I don't know, maybe, I don't know what the circumstances are. Rav Shefter likes to say any unhealthy lifestyle is that putting yourself at risk, is that problematic. So we have to figure out how to make sure to have a healthy lifestyle. Now, does that mean, I see Dr. Goldstein is on, we have to ask him, does that mean I can never have one Romanian hot dog? Does it mean I can't have one bite of Romanian liver, l'kavod Shabbos Kodesh? My father is waving, he's saying, achas v'shalom, no such thing. So that's impossible, So the doctors will tell you there's a tiny level of risk to have one Romanian hot dog. And Shomer P'sam Hashem, Baruch Hashem, so many of us, we have Romanian hot dogs, we have liver. Now, if you ate, the doctor would probably tell you, if you ate Romanian hot dogs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that might be more akin to smoking. It's a very unhealthy lifestyle. So making sure that we balance, what is Shomer P'sam Hashem? What's an acceptable level of risk? If the Surgeon General has to put on the box, this will kill you, then that's not Shomer P'sam Hashem. We all know it could kill you. So we have no qualms about that to say that that is problematic.
I wanted to mention something mathematical about cigarette smoking, and then I'll leave that topic. I read recently that every cigarette that one smokes, assuming one smokes for a long period of time, every cigarette that one smokes takes 6 minutes off of your life. Now, there are some people where that's not applicable. They smoke until they're 95. But if you look at a large group of people, that's a pretty interesting number.
Wow, that is really interesting.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that there aren't outliers. Like you said, there are people we know who live a whole lifetime smoking, cigarettes. But it doesn't mean that that is a healthy practice, because the halacha is going to recognize that we need to look at the statistics the same way that we look at statistic assessments when it comes to rove, like we mentioned before, about shatnez or kashrus of behemoths. There are 3 kinds of roves. We don't have time to talk about that today. There is a ruba de isa kaman, where you can count. I have 5 apples in front of me and 2 of them are rotten. That's rove healthy, good apples. And then you have a ruba de leisa kaman. That's called a statistical rove. A statistical rove means we have a sense from society of what the general statistics will be, even though you can't count them in front of you.
Rabbi Brandt? I have
Yes.
two questions. Question number one, I guess I'm worried about the arbitrariness of some of the suggestions, some of the risk assessment modalities. The one would be the looking at the community and seeing what people do. We know that people drive in a car, so therefore it must be a tolerable, at some point, smoking's an example. There's still an awful lot of people who smoke. It seems to me it would depend what sector of the community you looked at, and that you could make that say whatever you wanted it to say, kind of. Climate change, a lot of people still ignore it. Masks, if you look at the boardwalk, there are loads of people not wearing masks. So that's
an
one
interesting question. So that I think we would say we have to look, Rav Schechter would say we need to talk to the medical experts. So we need to find out from the physicians. And there are subcategories, different classes of people. So if you're over 65, that's one class of people. If you're over 75, it's another. If you're over 90, it's another. So within those groups, we need to keep making assessments from a data standpoint.
So where there is data, that trumps, you should pardon the expression, the community sentiment then?
Well, it needs to be hand in hand. If everybody decides we're all going to engage in a risky behavior that has a 25% mortality rate, the halacha would say that that's absolutely not acceptable. The Shomer P'sam Hashem is only on a small risk that's well less than Via Tamatzui.
Okay, and my other question, thank you. My other question is, I'm worried about the arbitrariness of picking a particular percentage as well. 10%, 5%, 7%. I'm looking for the source so that I can pick a number and have it mean something other than out of the air.
So we have to go back to that Mishkan Yaakov. I don't remember the simon off the top of my head, but at some point, I guess part of maybe just thinking about it from a practical standpoint, we're trying to figure out how many animals do you have to check to know that this herd or this group of animals is going to be likely non-kosher. What's the likelihood that this one animal is not going to be kosher among the other animals? So Chazal, they had to identify, the Rishonim had to figure out what is the percentage of risk that will trigger a requirement for a bedika, for checking. We don't check every animal for sirchas. We don't check every chicken that maybe it has a tiny puncture in its lung. We don't check chickens for lungs at all. So that's where the discussion begins in Chulin of ascertaining a point where you have to just make a decision. What's that level of risk?
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Interesting. I teach this.
Okay, there's a lot more to say, but this is a bite size for a lunch and learn discussion. I thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Karish, for having me.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to mention that the next Zoom meeting in this series will be 1 week from today. That's September the 22nd, next Tuesday at noon. And in fact, other than the 1 o'clock session today, all of the future meetings will be at noon. And the mathematically related topic will be the miracle of the Jewish calendar, and it will be presented by Rabbi Ari Zucker, who is a member of the YU Kollel. Also, just two more very short announcements. Anytime you want to know what the topic is for the following week, simply go to the KINS website. It'll always be posted there. And finally, all of our lectures are recorded. So if you miss part or all of any lecture, you're welcome to go to the KINS website where you can watch the video at a later point in time. And Rabbi, if you will let me share my screen for just a moment. Hopefully you can all see this. This is the schedule of lectures through November 10th. And you can see we have some wonderful speakers lined up, aside from Rabbi Brand, Rabbi Zucker, Rabbi Michael Myers, Rabbi Yonah Reese, Rabbi Noach Goldstein, another Kollel member, KINS assistant Rabbi Bressler, and Dr. Jonathan Greer, who is a PhD biochemist, and we'll be talking about the history and the science of the Torah. So hopefully you can all sign into any or all of those meetings whenever you're available to do so. If there are no other questions, then I thank you all for attending and listening, and we will see you next week at noon.